When it comes to women's MMA, few fighters spark more debate than Holly Holm. An upset win over one of the sport's all-time greats thrust her into stardom and sparked a decade-long struggle to try and replicate her achievements. 10 years on from that night in Australia, we take a look at Holm's MMA career and whether there was more to it than just a kick in the head. Welcome to the INC, and today we ask, was Holly Holm a one-hit wonder? While Australia marked the peak of Holm's career, its beginning came 8,000 miles away in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Holm was a natural athlete in her high school days, finding success in soccer, gymnastics, and swimming before taking up cardio kickboxing in her teens. It was there Holm caught the attention of noted MMA coach Mike Winkeljohn, who believed Holm had the frame and discipline to succeed in combat sports. In 2002, Holm made her professional boxing debut with a third-round stoppage of Martha Deichmann, and over the next decade became one of the most prolific welterweight fighters in the world, a two-time Ring Magazine Fighter of the Year, including wins over women's boxing pioneers Christy Martin and Mia St. John. Despite her accolades, Holm's profile remained largely local, with all but 3 of her fights taking place in her home state of New Mexico. Holm would claim over 18 titles throughout her career, the last of which coming in 2012 with a decision over IBF champion Anne-Sophie Mathis, where Holm avenged what many consider one of the most brutal knockouts in women's boxing history. Citing the higher pay for female fighters at the time, Holm began turning her focus towards MMA, making comfortable work of her early matches with a level of footwork well above her peers at the time. Highlights being a win over Strikeforce veteran Jan Finney and a one-off Bellator appearance in 2013. A 7-0 record saw Holm earn a UFC contract to join their bantamweight division, which at the time of her signing was staking a claim as the company's most popular weight class. Holm made her company debut in the co-main event of UFC 184, beating Ultimate Fighter veteran Raquel Pennington before a decision win over Marion Renault at Fight Night San Diego. While Holm did enough to win both fights, many believed the fighter needed more seasoning if she wanted to compete at the division's top level. So it came as a shock when the UFC announced their next move for the preacher's daughter. In August 2015, Holm was revealed as the next challenger for bantamweight champion Ronda Rousey, with their main event taking place in front of 60,000 fans in Melbourne, Australia. Rousey was considered one of the most dominant fighters in the sport's history, having won all but one of her matches in the first round and a marketability that saw her become one of the UFC's biggest crossover stars. While Rousey entered the match as a substantial favorite, some in the business questioned the champion's mindset, with Rousey rattled by Holm's perceived fake humility and her media obligations affecting her preparation for the bout. An appearance on the Jimmy Fallon show proving particularly ominous.
She's the type of fighter that you have to be very, very patient with. I feel like she's going to try and keep distance and keep far away from me and get me frustrated to a point I'll make a mistake and she can try and kick me in the head, but it's not going to go like that. Not the way that she wants.
Holm put on the performance of her career, using her superior footwork to avoid Rousey's bull rushes while constantly tagging the champion whenever she closed the distance, and even became the only woman to take Rousey down late in the first round. By the start of the second, a gassed Rousey was looking like the bull to Holm's matador, before the preacher's daughter delivered the shot heard round the world.
Beautiful. Beautiful. She's hurt. Anna's in trouble. She's hurt. Hey, Holly looking to finish. She's out.
Holm's win is still regarded as one of the biggest upsets in the sport's history, dethroning the seemingly unbeatable Rousey and thrusting the previously unknown fighter into a household name almost overnight. In the weeks after, Holm found herself part of a marketing blitz almost comparable to that of Rousey's, as figures both in and outside of the sport tried to latch on to her newfound star, from her hometown dedicating Holly Holm Day in her honor to being drunkenly serenaded by Conor McGregor fans. While all logic pointed towards an immediate rematch, Holm decided to remain active rather than wait for Rousey to return. A well-intentioned, but ultimately ill-fated decision. Holm's first title defense appropriately had a Rousey connection, as she faced the judoka's old rival Miesha Tate at UFC 196. Tate also had outstanding beef with Holm. The fighter had been promised a match with Rousey after beating Jessica Ai at Fight Night Chicago, but was passed over in favor of the preacher's daughter. Tate entered the match knowing it would likely be her last chance to claim an elusive UFC title. The fight was a conflict of styles, with Holm controlling the first round in the stand-up before Tate came close to a submission during a one-sided second, Holm showing an alarming lack of ground game given her champion status. While Holm rallied to win the next 2 rounds, her poor performance in the second meant Tate still had a chance if she could get the fight back to the mat, and in the dying stages of the 5th round, the former Strikeforce queen did just that. After nearly a decade of near misses and adversity, Miesha Tate had finally reached the UFC summit. But while fans applauded a popular veteran getting her kudos, it left the UFC in disarray. With Rousey's future uncertain, Holm had been positioned by the company as the face of the division in her absence. So losing to a fighter that Ronda had twice bested not only derailed their plans, but emboldened those who considered Holm's win in Australia a fluke. Holm decided that the best way to bounce back was to return to action as soon as possible, and was given a favorable matchup on paper against an undersized striker coming off a loss in their last fight. Valentina Shevchenko, however, didn't read the script, constantly countering Holm's flurries and catching the former boxer off guard with her takedowns. The fight moved Shevchenko to the top band of UFC bantamweights, while at the same time placing doubts over her conquered foe's place on that mantle. How would the UFC handle a fighter now on a 2-fight skid, the last of which coming in one-sided fashion? The answer was simple: another title fight! At UFC 208, Holm was booked against Germaine de Randamie for the inaugural featherweight title, the winner facing MMA legend Chris Cyborg, whose signing was the catalyst for the UFC creating the division. A competitive fight saw its crucial moment at the end of the 2nd round, when de Randamie struck Holm with a late punch that left the preacher's daughter out on her feet. De Randamie nearly repeated the trick at the end of the 3rd, but on both occasions wasn't penalized by referee Todd Anderson. Anderson's indiscretion would have a major impact, as de Randamie was given the unanimous decision to claim the inaugural title, one she eventually vacated after refusing to fight Cyborg, rendering the whole match pointless. De Randamie wasn't the only one with their stock damage. Holm was now on a 3-fight losing streak, and her decision not to wait for Rousey looked increasingly ill-judged, and by the time the Rowdy one returned to action, all talk of a rematch was effectively over. Holm finally bounced back with a win over Betchkahea at Fight Night Singapore, the head kick being the highlight of a poor match which had Holm losing on 2 of the judges' scorecards. The UFC, however, were happy with any excuse to get Holm back in the title picture, booking her against new featherweight champion Chris Cyborg at UFC 219, the match the company had always planned upon creating the division. Holm became one of the few fighters not to be daunted by the MMA legend, attempting to neutralize the Brazilian's power by constantly pressing her against the fence, a move Holm would become synonymous with during the second half of her career. The brute strength, however, would ultimately prove too much for Holm, and while the fighter claimed a moral victory in taking Cyborg the distance, it was the Brazilian that took the spoils and the featherweight title. Holm stayed at 145 for her match with UFC newcomer Megan Anderson, showing continued improvements in her grappling to neutralize the lanky Australian. Holm was set to play gatekeeper again when she was linked to a match with unbeaten Aspen Ladd. That was until the fighter activated her infinite title shot cheat code and was booked against Amanda Nunes in the co-main event of UFC 239. The fight marked Holm's 4th title shot in her past 8 fights. It would also be her shortest. The fight marked the first time Holm had been KO'd in her MMA career, ironically by the same head kick that transformed her career 4 years earlier. Now in her 40s, the fight marked the last time Holm ever challenged for a UFC title, even if she, and the UFC, tried their hardest to do otherwise. As the UFC entered their lockdown era, Holm's appearances became more sporadic, as injuries and her advancing age limited her to 6 fights over the next 5 years. A second win over Raquel Pennington was followed by a shutout of Irene Aldana on Fight Island, and fans begrudgingly accepted the prospect of Holm getting yet another shot at the belt. In February 2021, Holm was booked in a #1 contender match with Juliana Pena, only for the bout to fall through after Holm underwent surgery for kidney issues. Rather than reschedule, the UFC fast-tracked Peña straight to a title match, beating Amanda Nunes in one of the greatest upsets in company history. Holm's return instead came in a main event with Ketlen Vieira at the UFC Apex. Holm attempted to dictate the pace with her trademark flurries, but found herself constantly countered by the hard-hitting Vieira, who caught the fighter in a choke midway through the second. The fight came down to whether the judges valued Holm's activity or Vieira's more meaningful strikes. In the end, it was the Brazilian who gained the judges' nod in a controversial split decision, with Holm's increasingly cautious fighting style cited as a factor in her loss. Holm returned to winning ways with a comfortable performance over Yana Santos at Fight Night San Antonio, but attracted controversy in her post-fight interview when she called on fans to, quote, protect the children, a statement used by right-wing political groups in their attacks on the LGBT community. After the uproar died down, Holm found herself in an enviable position. The women's bantamweight title had recently been vacated, and as the only fighter in the division with any real star power, it was almost inevitable that Holm would be in the discussion over crowning a new champion. Standing in her way was Mayra Bueno Silva. The Brazilian was unbeaten since moving to bantamweight in 2022, but was still considered unproven against the division's elite. A match between the two was booked in June 2023, with the winner almost certain to earn a shot at the vacant belt. Holm controlled the early going with her now trademark wall install, but appeared unsettled by the forward pressure and power shots of her Brazilian opponent. A big right hand early in the second forced Holm into her comfort zone on the fence, and straight into the trap of the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt.
And there's the tap!
Beautiful. Saw that modified guillotine.
Silva is in the mix!
Silva caught Holm with a standing guillotine just 38 seconds into the second round. The irony of the former boxer being caught by a submission, normally used to deter submission threats. Silva would take the bantamweight title fight for herself, losing a decision to Holm's former conquest, Raquel Pennington. 2024 marked the first time Holm appeared off a UFC main card, as she welcomed company newcomer Kayla Harrison on the prelims of UFC 300. Harrison entered the bout as one of the most hyped female debutantes of recent years, having been a two-time Olympic gold medalist and former champion of the PFL. With her judo background and the infamy of her opponent, the comparisons to Rousey were almost inevitable. Harrison, however, wouldn't fall into the same trap, dominating the aging Holm, who appeared lost against her much larger opponent. A win over an Olympic judoka thrust Holm into MMA relevance. A loss to one 9 years later effectively ended it.
She taps it! Kayla Harrison has arrived in the big show! She submits Holly Holm around two.
The loss placed Holm at a career crossroads. It was clear to even her most ardent fans that the preacher's daughter had lost a step, both as a fighter and as a reliable source of main event-worthy entertainment. Holm was still capable of beating most of the bantamweight top 15, but the risk-adverse way she was doing so left a lot to be desired. One potential fight, however, captured the public's attention. Former champion Miesha Tate had returned to MMA after a 5-year sabbatical and began actively campaigning for a match with Holm, a rematch between two fan-favorite veterans and a final send-off to the women's bantamweight golden age. It therefore came as a shock when, in January of 2025, it was revealed that Holm had requested her release from her UFC contract, leaving the promotion with a 5-8 run in the 10 years following her match with Rousey. After being one of several fighters linked to the ill-fated GFL, Holm has remained active in combat sports circles, making a successful return to boxing for Jake Paul's MVP promotions, as well as a star turn for Eric Bischoff's Real American Wrestling. An amazing achievement given she didn't have a wall to press her opponent against. If Holly Holm is a one-hit wonder, it's in the same mold as Aha or Hansen. The fighter was a fixture of the bantamweight top 10 for several years and beat a number of solid fighters during that time, but the scale of the Rousey win was such that it overshadowed all of her other achievements, and later became a crutch to justify her relevance when her form and performances no longer warranted it. A combat pioneer, or simply a girl with a big kick, debate over Holly Holm's career will continue long after she hangs up the gloves. But ultimately, maybe there's one person whose opinion matters more than most.
Oh, you think this is funny? You think this is funny? Wipe that stupid smile off your face.
This is the INC. Please like, share, and subscribe. Post your feedback in the comments and donate to our Patreon page for hours of exclusive content.